Margaret O'Sullivan stood perfectly still in the corner of her husband's family dining room, watching him laugh at something the blonde woman beside him had whispered. The woman's hand rested too comfortably on his forearm. His mother smiled approvingly from across the table. No one had noticed Margaret yet. She had arrived late quietly, through the side entrance, carrying the apple tart she'd baked that afternoon. The same tart his mother always praised, then forgot to credit her for. But tonight was different. Tonight, Margaret wasn't just the overlooked wife in the modest cardigan and sensible shoes. Tonight she was the woman who had signed the papers that morning. The papers that made her the new owner of Turner and Associates, the failing architecture firm that had been in her husband's family for 3 generations. He didn't know yet. None of them did. And as she watched him lean closer to the blonde woman, his hand briefly touching her knee beneath the table, Margaret realized something with perfect, cold clarity. She was done protecting him. By the way, we drop intriguing stories like this every day. Please subscribe for more. Margaret had learned to make herself small, not physically, though her husband's family had made enough comments about her weight over the years. Comments disguised as concern, delivered with tight smiles over Sunday roasts. Perhaps just a small portion, Margaret. You know, walking does wonders. My sister lost 2 stone just by walking. No, Margaret had learned to make herself small in other ways. Smaller opinions, softer voice, less space taken up in conversations. She had become the woman who arrived early to help set up and stayed late to clean. The woman who remembered everyone's birthdays and dietary requirements. The woman who never caused a fuss. It hadn't always been this way. Margaret Mary O'Sullivan had grown up in Dublin, the only child of Catherine O'Sullivan, a woman whose name appeared in the business pages more often than the society columns. Catherine had built an empire quietly without fanfare in commercial property development. She owned half of Temple Bar by the time Margaret was 10 and had expanded into London, Manchester, and Edinburgh by the time Margaret turned 16. But Catherine had taught her daughter something crucial. True power is invisible. Let them underestimate you, Catherine had said, sitting in her modest kitchen in Ranelagh, drinking tea from a chipped mug despite the millions in her accounts. Let them think you're ordinary. It's the safest place to stand. Margaret remembered being 14, sitting in the back of a boardroom while her mother negotiated the purchase of a failing hotel chain. The men across the table had spoken to Catherine as if she were a secretary taking notes. They'd adjusted their ties and explained basic financial concepts, slowly, with exaggerated patience. Catherine had let them finish. Then she'd bought their company for 30% less than they'd hoped, restructured their debt, and kept them on as managers, but never let them forget who owned the walls they worked within. See, Catherine had said afterward, in the car. They never saw it coming because they never really looked. Margaret had inherited everything when her mother died suddenly of an aneurysm at 58. The entire portfolio, the property holdings, the investment trusts, the offshore accounts, the carefully structured web of LLCs and holding companies that kept Catherine O'Sullivan's wealth invisible to everyone except the lawyers and accountants who managed it. Margaret had been 23. She'd also just met James Turner. James was 26, charming, from a respected Anglo-Irish family in London, working at his father's architecture firm in Bloomsbury. He had an easy smile and a public school confidence that made rooms feel smaller and conversations feel effortless. He played rugby on weekends and drank in pubs where everyone knew his name. He was everything Margaret thought she should want, and crucially, he had no idea who she really was. Margaret had been working as an admin assistant at a cultural foundation in King's Cross, a job she'd taken deliberately to keep herself grounded, to stay normal. She wore high street clothes and shared a flat with 2 other girls in Archway. She took the tube to work and brought lunch from home. James had met her at a gallery opening in Shoreditch. He'd liked her quietness, her lack of pretension, the way she listened more than she spoke. He'd said she was refreshingly real. They'd dated for 8 months before he proposed. Small wedding, registry office in Islington, followed by dinner at a bistro in Clerkenwell. His family had been polite but puzzled. They'd clearly expected someone more polished, someone from their world. But James had insisted. "I don't want some society girl," he'd told his mother over lunch one Sunday. "Margaret's genuine. She's kind. She doesn't care about all that superficial nonsense." What he'd meant, though Margaret understood this only later, was that she was manageable, grateful, unlikely to challenge him. The first 5 years of marriage had been, if not perfect, then comfortable. They'd rented a small 2-bedroom flat in Kentish Town. James worked long hours at the firm, trying to prove himself to his father, Edward Turner, a stern man who spoke rarely and smiled less. Margaret had taken a part-time job at a charity bookshop in Camden and spent her afternoons walking along the canal. She'd kept her inheritance completely separate, legally, financially, practically. Her lawyers had structured everything under her maiden name, O'Sullivan, through a series of trusts her mother had established. James knew she had some family money, enough that she didn't need to work full-time, but he'd never asked for details. And Margaret had never offered them. She'd told herself it was about protection, about keeping something of her own, about honouring her mother's advice. But truthfully, she'd been afraid. Afraid that if James knew, everything would change, that he'd see her differently, that his family would see her differently, that the quiet, simple life she'd built would collapse under the weight of expectation and resentment. So she'd stayed small. She'd nodded through his mother's pointed comments about her cooking, her clothes, her failure to produce grandchildren quickly enough. She'd smiled through his father's dismissive remarks about modern women and lack of ambition. She'd sat quietly at family dinners while James's younger sister, Fiona, dominated every conversation with stories of her PR career and her flat in Notting Hill. And slowly over the years, James had begun to echo his family's tone. "Do you think you could make a bit more effort?" he'd said once after a particularly tense Sunday lunch. "My mother's just trying to help." "Perhaps if you joined a gym," he'd suggested another time. "Not for me, for you, for your health." "You're so quiet sometimes," he'd said more recently with a hint of frustration. "It's like you're not even there." The irony was almost unbearable. Margaret was there. She was always there. She was the one who remembered his father's whiskey preference, his mother's gluten intolerance, his sister's nut allergy. She was the one who organised the birthday dinners, the anniversary gifts, the thank you notes that went out under James's name. She was the one holding their life together while he slowly, steadily pulled away. The affair had started 6 months ago. Margaret had known immediately the way women always know. The late meetings that didn't match his calendar, the new cologne, the sudden interest in going to the gym. The phone turned face down on the table. His name was Victoria. Victoria Langley, 28, blonde, worked in the marketing department at Turner and Associates. Margaret had seen her once briefly at the firm's summer party. She'd been wearing a dress that cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe, laughing loudly at something Edward Turner had said. James's father had looked pleased. Margaret had said nothing. She'd gone home that night, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat in the dark living room, staring at the stack of mail on the side table. Bills, charity appeals, a letter from her solicitor about the quarterly trust review, and beneath it all, a company prospectus her financial manager had flagged for her review. Turner and Associates was failing, badly. Years of poor decisions, refusal to modernize, over-reliance on legacy clients who were dying off or retiring. Edward Turner had run the firm like it was still 1985, and James, for all his charm, had inherited his father's arrogance without his discipline. The company was hemorrhaging money. Margaret had read the prospectus carefully. She'd made notes. She'd called her solicitor the next morning. "I want to buy it," she'd said. There'd been a pause on the line. "Margaret, are you certain? This is your husband's family business." "I'm certain." "He'll find out eventually." "Not if we're careful. I want the purchase made through the O'Sullivan Holdings Trust. No direct link to me. Use the legal name only. Keep everything behind the corporate veil." Another pause. "This will be complicated. That's why I pay you." The deal had taken 4 months to structure. The lawyers had been meticulous. The purchase had gone through 3 days ago, finalised that morning with Margaret's signature on the final documents. Turner and Associates now belonged to her. James still didn't know. And tonight, as she stood in the doorway of his family's dining room, watching him laugh with his mistress at the table where his wife should have been sitting, Margaret felt the last thread of loyalty snap cleanly in half. The dining room in the Turner family home in Highgate was everything Margaret had learned to find suffocating. High ceilings, heavy curtains, dark wood furniture that had been in the family for generations, portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls. Edward Turner sat at the head of the table, his grey hair combed back, his posture military straight despite his 70 years. His wife Diana sat to his right, her pearls catching the candlelight, her expression pleasant and watchful. James sat across from his sister Fiona and her husband Philip. And beside James, in the seat where Margaret usually sat, was Victoria Langley. Margaret took all of this in from the doorway. No one had noticed her yet. They were too deep in conversation, too comfortable, too certain of their world. She adjusted her grip on the apple tart and stepped forward. "Sorry I'm late," she said quietly. The room went still. James looked up sharply, his face cycling through surprise, guilt, and something close to irritation in the space of 2 seconds. Victoria's hand, which had been resting on the table near James's, withdrew smoothly. Diana recovered first, her smile snapping into place. "Margaret, how lovely. We'd almost given up on you." "Traffic," Margaret said simply. She walked to the sideboard and set down the tart. "I brought dessert." "How thoughtful," Diana said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. Edward didn't look up from his wine. Fiona glanced at Philip, her eyebrows raised slightly, an unspoken communication passing between them. James stood abruptly. "Margaret, this is Victoria. She works with us. Dad invited her to discuss the new project." Victoria extended her hand, her smile warm and professional. "So nice to finally meet you. James talks about you all the time." Margaret shook her hand. Victoria's grip was firm, confident. She smelled expensive. "Does he?" Margaret said. It wasn't a question. She took her seat at the far end of the table, the chair someone had hastily pulled over from the corner. There was no place setting waiting for her, no wine glass, no napkin. Diana noticed and fluttered her hands. Oh dear. Let me. It's fine, Margaret said. I'm not very hungry anyway. The table settled into an awkward silence. Then Edward cleared his throat. Victoria was just telling us about the pitch for the Southwark development. Quite impressive, actually. Victoria leaned forward, eager to reclaim the momentum. It's a really exciting opportunity. Mixed-use, residential and commercial, right on the river. If we land this, it could completely turn things around for the firm. Margaret said nothing. She folded her hands in her lap and watched. James jumped in, his voice a little too loud, a little too bright. Victoria's been instrumental in putting the pitch together. She's got a real head for this sort of thing. How wonderful, Margaret said softly. Fiona smirked into her wine glass. Diana changed the subject with the skill of someone who'd spent decades smoothing over uncomfortable moments. Margaret, how's the bookshop? Still keeping you busy? It closed last month, actually. Diana blinked. Oh, I didn't realise. I didn't mention it. Another silence. Philip, Fiona's husband, cleared his throat. Well, I'm sure you'll find something else. Plenty of opportunities out there. Margaret smiled faintly. I'm sure. The first course arrived. Edward insisted on formal dinners, and the conversation shifted to safer topics. Fiona's latest client, Philip's golf game, the ridiculous price of parking in central London. Margaret ate slowly, barely tasting the food, watching the dynamics play out around her. Victoria was good. She knew exactly when to speak and when to listen. She laughed at Edward's dry observations, asked Diana intelligent questions about her garden, complimented Fiona's earrings. She played the room like someone who'd studied the choreography in advance. And James watched her with something close to admiration. Margaret had seen that expression before, years ago, directed at her. Halfway through the main course, Edward set down his fork and looked at James. We need to talk seriously about the firm's situation. James stiffened. Dad, not now. When then? We're running out of time. The bank's losing patience. Diana murmured. Edward, perhaps after dinner. I'm simply stating facts. Edward's voice was clipped, controlled. We've got 3 months, maybe 4, before we have to make some very difficult decisions. Victoria spoke up, her tone careful. There are options. The Southwark pitch could change everything. Edward gave her a long look. Could, not will. We've also been approached, James said suddenly, by an investment group. They're interested in a partnership, possibly a buyout. Margaret's pulse quickened, but her face remained still. Fiona leaned forward. A buyout? You'd sell? We're exploring options, James said defensively. It's preliminary. Edward's jaw tightened. Your grandfather built this firm. I've spent 40 years maintaining it. The idea of selling to some faceless corporate entity. It's better than bankruptcy, James snapped. The table went silent. Diana's smile had frozen in place. Fiona and Philip exchanged glances. Victoria looked down at her plate, suddenly very interested in her food. Margaret took a sip of water and waited. Edward spoke quietly, his voice carrying more weight than any shout. This family does not fail. Then the family needs to adapt, James shot back. We can't keep running things like it's 1985. The world's changed. Clients want innovation, sustainability, modern design. Not another Georgian pastiche. There's nothing wrong with tradition. There is when it bankrupts you. The argument was clearly an old one, worn smooth by repetition. Margaret had heard variations of it for years. James frustrated by his father's rigidity, Edward disappointed by his son's lack of reverence for legacy. But tonight, it had an edge, a desperation, because this time, the threat was real. Victoria tried to mediate. Maybe there's a middle ground. We could bring in a strategic partner, someone who understands the firm's heritage, but can also help modernize operations. Edward didn't respond. He simply stood, his napkin falling from his lap, and left the room. Diana fluttered after him. "Edward, your blood pressure?" The door closed. Fiona exhaled slowly. Well, that went well. James dropped his head into his hands. Christ! Victoria touched his shoulder, a brief gesture but intimate. "It'll be okay. We'll figure it out." Margaret watched James lean into that touch just slightly, watched him take comfort from a woman who wasn't his wife, and she felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, just a strange, liberating emptiness. Fiona stood abruptly. "I need more wine. Anyone else?" Philip followed her out, murmuring something about helping, which left Margaret, James and Victoria at the table. The silence stretched. Finally, James looked up. "You didn't have to come tonight." Margaret met his eyes. "You're my husband. Why wouldn't I come to a family dinner?" "I just meant, with everything going on, the stress, I didn't think you'd..." He stopped, seemingly unable to finish the thought. Victoria stood gracefully. "I should check on Diana. See if she needs help with dessert." She left, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood. Margaret and James sat alone. He rubbed his face. "I'm sorry about the seating, about everything. Tonight's just been a lot." "Has it?" He looked at her then, really looked, and seemed to see something that unsettled him. "Are you all right?" Margaret stood, smoothing her cardigan. "I'm fine, James, perfectly fine." She walked toward the kitchen, then paused in the doorway. "The investment group that approached you, did they give a name?" James frowned. "Why?" "Just curious." "O'Sullivan Holdings. Why?" Margaret smiled faintly. "No reason." She continued into the kitchen, leaving him sitting alone at the table, confused and slightly uneasy, though he couldn't have said exactly why. In the kitchen, Diana was fussing with plates while Victoria stood nearby, offering help that wasn't needed. Margaret picked up the apple tart. "I'll serve this." Diana looked relieved to have something to do with her hands. "That would be lovely, dear." Margaret cut clean slices, arranged them carefully, added small forks. Her movements were precise, automatic. Victoria watched her. "You made this? It looks professional." "My mother's recipe," Margaret said. "She must have been a wonderful cook." "She was a wonderful businesswoman. The cooking was just something she did to relax." Victoria's smile flickered slightly, unsure how to respond. Margaret carried the plates back to the dining room. Edward had returned, seated stiffly, his expression unreadable. Diana hovered nervously. Fiona and Philip had resumed their seats, the wine bottle noticeably emptier. James sat exactly where she'd left him, staring at nothing. Margaret served the dessert in silence. Everyone ate. Everyone complimented the tart. Everyone pretended the evening hadn't fractured. And through it all, Margaret felt herself settling into a strange calm. A clarity she hadn't felt in years. She'd spent so long trying to fit into this family, trying to earn their approval, trying to be small enough, quiet enough, acceptable enough. But she'd had it backward. She'd never needed their approval. They needed hers. The letter arrived by courier at 9 o'clock the next morning. Margaret was in the kitchen of their Kentish town flat, drinking tea and reading the Financial Times, when James emerged from the bedroom, bleary-eyed and moving slowly. He'd had too much wine the night before. The knock startled them both. James opened the door to find a professional courier holding a large manila envelope. "Mr. James Turner." "Yes?" "Sign here, please." James signed, frowning, and closed the door. He turned the envelope over in his hands. Heavy paper. Expensive. The return address was a law firm in the city. Hutchins, Warwick and Cole. He opened it standing in the hallway. Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway, her teacup steady in both hands. She watched his face change as he read. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then something close to panic. "What is this?" he said, his voice strange. "What the hell is this?" He looked up at her. Margaret set down her tea. "What does it say?" "It says..." He shook his head, reading again as if the words might have changed. "It says Turner and Associates has been purchased by O'Sullivan Holdings, effective immediately. All current board members are. We're being retained pending review, but..." He looked up, his face pale. "This can't be right." "It's right," Margaret said quietly. "But we haven't agreed to anything. Dad would never..." He stopped. "O'Sullivan Holdings. That's the group I mentioned. The one that approached us." "Yes. But how did they..." He stared at her and she saw the moment understanding began to dawn. Slow, reluctant, impossible to accept. "Margaret, your last name, before we married, it was O'Sullivan," she said. "Yes." The envelope slipped from his hands. Margaret moved past him into the living room and picked up her handbag. From it, she withdrew a thin folder. She'd prepared it the night before, after coming home from the dinner. After lying awake beside her husband, listening to him sleep, knowing everything was about to change, she handed him the folder. "What is this?" His voice was barely a whisper. "The truth." He opened it. Inside were documents, corporate filings, trust instruments, property deeds, bank statements, a complete record of the O'Sullivan Holdings portfolio, Margaret's portfolio. James sank onto the sofa, reading page after page, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Margaret sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, and waited. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wide, lost. "You own all of this entire time?" "Yes." "But why didn't you tell me?" "You never asked." "That's not..." He shook his head, frustrated. "People don't just hide this sort of thing. This isn't pocket change, Margaret. This is..." "Generational wealth," she finished. "Yes. My mother built it. I inherited it when she died, when we were first dating." "Yes. And you said nothing." "I said I had some family money. That was true." "Some family money." His voice rose. "Margaret, you own half of Dublin. You own commercial properties across 3 countries. You have... Christ, this trust alone is worth..." He couldn't finish. Margaret's voice remained calm. "I wanted to be sure you married me for the right reasons." That landed hard. James's face flushed. "That's not fair, isn't it?" He stood abruptly, pacing, running his hands through his hair. "I can't believe this. All these years. All the times my family. All the comments about you not working, about you not contributing, about..." He stopped, something ugly crossing his face. "You let them think you were nothing." "I let them reveal who they were," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference." "This is insane." He spun to face her. Why now? Why buy the firm now? Because it was failing. Because your father was too proud to accept help from anyone outside the family. Because you were too distracted by... She paused. Other things. His face went white. What does that mean? Margaret stood and walked to the window. Outside, the morning was grey and damp, typical London autumn weather. People hurried past with umbrellas and takeaway coffees, living their ordinary lives. I know about Victoria, she said quietly. The silence behind her was absolute. When she turned back, James had collapsed onto the sofa, his head in his hands. It's not... We haven't... He stopped, unable to finish the lie. Don't, Margaret said. Please don't insult me further. He looked up at her, and there were tears in his eyes. Real tears. I'm sorry, God, Margaret, I'm so sorry. Are you? Yes. I never meant... It just happened. The stress at work, the pressure from Dad and Victoria. She understood. She listened. And you were always so quiet, so distant, I thought. You thought I didn't care, Margaret finished. You thought I was too simple, too dull, too... She gestured at herself. Ordinary. No, that's not. It's exactly what you thought, what your family thought, what Victoria thinks. Margaret's voice remained steady. And you know what? I let you think it. Because it was easier than explaining that I was managing a portfolio worth hundreds of millions. Easier than telling you I spent my afternoons on conference calls with property developers in Berlin and Dublin and Manchester. Easier than admitting that the quiet, simple wife you were so content to overlook was actually the one person who could save everything your family built. James stared at her, speechless. Margaret picked up her bag. I've bought the firm. I've installed new management. Your father can stay on as a consultant if he chooses, but he's no longer making operational decisions. You can stay as well, if you're willing to actually work, instead of coasting on the family name. Margaret, wait. There's one more thing. She reached into her bag and withdrew another envelope. This one she'd carried with her for 3 days, waiting for the right moment. She handed it to him. He took it with shaking hands. Divorce papers, she said simply. You'll be treated fairly. I'm not interested in revenge, but I'm done being small. Please, he whispered. Please, we can fix this. I'll end things with Victoria. I'll do whatever you want. Just please. James. Her voice was gentle now, almost kind. It's not about Victoria, not really. It's about the fact that you felt entitled to her, that you looked at me every day and saw someone who should be grateful you stayed, someone who had nothing to offer except quiet compliance. That's not true. It is true. And if I'm being honest, I let it happen. I made myself small because I was afraid of being used for my money. But in trying to avoid that, I ended up in something worse. I ended up invisible. She walked to the door, then paused. I'll have my things collected this week. You can stay in the flat until the lease is up. After that, she shrugged. You'll figure it out. You're very good at landing on your feet. Where will you go? Margaret smiled faintly. I have properties in 4 cities. I'll manage. She opened the door. I loved you, James said, his voice breaking. Margaret looked back at him one last time. He was crying openly now, slumped on the sofa, surrounded by documents that proved how thoroughly he'd underestimated his wife. I know, she said, but you loved the version of me that made you feel important more than you loved me. She closed the door quietly behind her. Outside, the courier was still waiting by a sleek black car. He opened the rear door for her. Ms. O'Sullivan, where to? Margaret settled into the seat. The office, please. I have a board meeting at 10. The car pulled smoothly into traffic. Margaret looked out the window at the city passing by. She thought about her mother, about the quiet power Catherine had wielded, about the lessons she'd spent a lifetime trying to teach her daughter. True strength doesn't announce itself. It simply exists. And when the time comes, it acts. Margaret pulled out her phone and opened her email. There were already messages from the new management team at Turner & Associates, questions about restructuring, proposals for modernization, requests for her input. She began typing replies. Behind her, in the Kentish Town flat, James Turner sat alone, holding divorce papers he never imagined receiving, in a home he could no longer afford, with a career that now depended entirely on the wife he'd betrayed. And across London, in a Highgate house that had stood for generations, Edward Turner would soon receive his own letter informing him that his family's firm now had a new owner, a woman, Anne O'Sullivan. The quiet daughter-in-law he'd never bothered to know. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the Turner & Associates boardroom, now officially rebranded as Turner O'Sullivan Architects, watching the team present the completed Southwark development design. They'd won the pitch. The design was bold, sustainable, beautiful. Everything the firm should have been doing for years. Victoria had resigned 3 weeks after the acquisition. She'd submitted a polite letter citing personal reasons and exciting new opportunities. Margaret had accepted it without comment. James still worked at the firm. He came in early, stayed late, and kept his head down. He was good at his job when he actually focused on it. Margaret had realised that his real problem was never lack of talent. It was lack of stakes. He'd never had to prove himself before. Now he did. They were civil to each other, professional. Sometimes late at night, Margaret wondered if there was a version of their story where things turned out differently, where she'd been honest from the beginning, where he'd been curious enough to ask. But she didn't dwell on it. Edward had taken the news hardest. He'd raged, threatened legal action, refused to speak to Margaret for 2 months. But eventually, when he saw the firm stabilising, saw the new contracts coming in, saw his son actually working with purpose, he'd softened. He'd never apologised, but he'd started asking her opinion in meetings. It was progress. Diana had been surprisingly gracious. She'd invited Margaret to lunch one afternoon, just the two of them, and had said very quietly, "I'm sorry for the comments, for not seeing you." Margaret had accepted. Fiona had sent a bottle of very expensive champagne with a note that read, "Well played." The divorce had been finalised with minimal drama. James had signed without contest. He'd moved to a smaller flat in Finsbury Park and started therapy. Margaret had kept the Kentish Town flat. She liked it. It was hers. She'd also bought a small cottage in County Cork, near where her mother had grown up. She went there sometimes on weekends when the city felt too heavy. She was learning to take up space again, to speak up in meetings, to trust her own judgment, to stop apologising for existing. It was harder than she'd expected, but she was learning. As the presentation ended and the team began gathering their materials, one of the junior architects, a young woman named Sophie who reminded Margaret a little of her younger self, approached nervously. "Ms. O'Sullivan, could I ask you something?" "Of course. How did you... I mean..." Sophie struggled with the words. "How did you know when it was time to stop being quiet?" Margaret smiled. When staying quiet started costing more than speaking up. Sophie nodded slowly, processing. Margaret touched her shoulder gently. You'll know. When the time comes, you'll know. That evening, Margaret sat in her flat with a cup of tea and her mother's old journal. Catherine had kept meticulous records, not just of business decisions but of life lessons, small observations about power and dignity and self-worth. Margaret had started reading through it after the divorce, finding comfort in her mother's voice. One entry stood out tonight. People will only treat you as well as you teach them to. And sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for them is walk away from anyone who refuses to learn. Margaret closed the journal and looked around her flat. Her space, her choices, her life. Outside, London hummed and sparkled. Millions of people living their complicated, messy, beautiful lives. And Margaret O'Sullivan, no longer Turner, never again someone's disappointing wife, sat in her quiet flat, finally taking up all the space she needed. Finally visible. Finally, completely, herself. If you enjoyed this, kindly subscribe for more stories like this on this channel.